Good morning all and welcome. My name is Colin Jennings. I'm the National Policy Manager of Cities, Housing and Planning at the Property Council of Australia. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting your exclusive behind-the-scenes look at the Amberley, a world-class build-to-rent project situated in the heart of New York. The Amberley sits on Lenape land in New York, so we pay our respects to the First Nations people of New York and the United States. We are also streaming to you live from our Sydney office, which is on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. On behalf of the Property Council of Australia, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people and the traditional custodians of country from the lands on which you are joining us from today, and pay our respects to past, present and emerging elders. The format of today's event will include your behind-the-scenes virtual tour featuring the Amberley, New York. We will then hear from the project team, as well as our two resident build-to-rent experts from Greystar and CBRE to discuss what the Australian property sector can learn from this highly successful project. I'm certainly excited to get stuck in today, but before we do, I would like to thank our virtual tour host, Woods Bagot, especially the wonderful Alex Warland for coordinating this international event, and our co-partner, Minta Ellison. This year has been a challenging one, and we deeply appreciate both Woods Bagot and Minta Ellison's ongoing support to be able to deliver these amazing events to our members. As technology likes to throw us a curveball at the worst moments, we have provided you with a link to the video embedded in a fact sheet with the project images in case you have difficulty watching this video from Teams. The link can be found in the email attachment we sent just before this session. We will also send around a recording of the event and a link to the video in the following days. I'd also like to highlight that as we describe build to rent and some residential models slightly differently from our American friends, please consider the following terms interchangeable throughout the day, being build to rent and multifamily. Also, for those that aren't fluent in American residential language, condos and apartments might crop up. In the US, a condo is akin to our traditional build-to-sell units as they are owned by individuals, whereas apartments are rental properties that are usually owned, not just managed, by a property management company. Well, I certainly can't wait any longer. Let's get to it. So, from the comfort of your computer, sit back, relax, and enjoy a short virtual site tour of the Amberley.
Hi, I'm Matt Stevenson from the Woods Bagot New York studio, and I'm excited to take you on a virtual site tour through our recently completed project, the Amberley, in Brooklyn, New York. The project is uniquely positioned between three distinct Brooklyn neighborhoods. Downtown Brooklyn, from which the building takes its tower scale, the Dumbo neighborhood near the East River, which provided many of the materiality cues for the building and the site, and Brooklyn Heights, where traditional New York brownstone homes served as the inspiration for the facade patterning of the building, allowing larger floor-to-ceiling glass in residential living and dining areas, and more private, opaque areas at bedrooms. The Amberley project is designed at just under 33,000 square meters in Brooklyn, New York. The project includes a 270-unit residential tower positioned at the center of the through-block site, which allows for a large south-facing public plaza welcoming residents into the oversized live-work lobby. The amenities at the Amberley are carefully placed throughout the building section, with fitness areas below grade, a large working lobby at the ground floor, a roof deck with grill and seating at the 9th floor, and the overlook sitting at the top of the residential massing. This idea to distribute the amenities was established to try and invigorate as many different areas within the building and allow each of the spaces' distinct location and design cater to different resident activities. The overlook space is really unique because instead of placing high-value residential units at the upper level, the Amberley allowed that space to be a common amenity for all residents of the building. Within the program, there is a community facility at the base of the building, adjacent to the residential lobby, and a 5,500 square meter office building that establishes a new street wall along the west edge of the site. That office program is grounded through 1,000 square meters of retail that creates a new way of engaging the public along the busy J Street corridor. Each of these building components is integrated into the site's design through the use of common materials: terracotta, blackened metal, and glass. The amazing views of the city, its waterways and bridges, is certainly one of the most appealing aspects of the project. The residential units were designed so that as soon as each residential unit door is open, a view is immediately presented through floor-to-ceiling glazing within the living space, engaging each resident with their own private vision of the city. It's been really fun visiting the building now that it's fully occupied and seeing the amenity spaces being used in different ways. We've seen a lot of residents on laptops working in the plaza under some trees or within the ground floor lobby, viewing parties for 4th of July fireworks at the 33rd floor overlook, and my personal favorite, wedding dance lessons on the 9th floor terrace after work. We've seen the lounges used even more while New York has been working from home this year. While maintaining social distances, those spaces, especially the outdoor spaces, have been an amazing complement to the individual residential units. While we're always enthusiastic to talk about the architectural form, materiality, and use types, we're most excited by the spaces the building creates to bring residents together or to interact with the public through community facilities, beautifully designed plazas, or the integration of retail to activate streets in a whole new way. We'd love to continue that discussion with you and hope you'll reach out, but for now, thank you for touring the Amberley project with us.
Well, what an impressive building. We now move on to our informative session with our speakers for today. So I'll hand you over to Nathan Devison. Nathan is the managing partner for the Sydney office at Minter Ellison. He also leads the firm's state taxes and stamp duty practice. Nathan advises on complex real estate transactions, specialising in transaction structuring and state tax issues. Nathan also sits on the Property Council of Australia's Build to Rent Roundtable and has been recently working with a number of clients who are establishing their BTR portfolios in Australia. So I'll leave you in his good hands. As always, if you have any questions throughout today's discussion, please use the chat function to submit. You can find this by moving your mouse and a menu bar will appear across your screen. We do encourage you to ask questions as they pop into your head throughout the session. And if you prefer, you can submit them anonymously. Over to you, Nathan.
Colin, thanks very much and welcome everyone to this live event this morning. And really, to get some insight into a fantastic project in Brooklyn and a bit of a window to what the sector will become, hopefully, in Australia. So I'm going to just give a quick intro to our panellists and then I'll ask each of them to outline their role on this project. But we've pulled together a great team of people who've been involved in the project and then some experts on the Australian market to give us some insights. So first up, we're going to have our designer from Woods Bagot, Matt Stephenson, whose voice you heard on the video. We'll then be talking to the tenant and leasing strategy leader from Corcoran, Jody Stassi. Then the owner and operator from Greystar, Adam Pillay. And then we'll look a bit more broadly around branding and tenant retention from Irico. We'll talk to Stephen Cornwall. And finally, to get some real insight into the Australian local market from CBRE, Kate Heaney. So, Matt, I might pass over to you now to really outline your role in the project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nathan. So as Nathan said, my name is Matt Stevenson. I'm an associate principal with Woods Bagot Architects here in New York, and I led the design and delivery of the Amberley project in Brooklyn. And through that process, really kind of from the very beginning, really understanding the site in a very deep and meaningful way, understanding what strengths it has, and a lot of that is around the views that you saw in that last video. And also working with Jody through that process to really understand not only what the unit mix should be for this location and this specific project, but also how that mix works as far as individual units, the distribution of amenity spaces through the building, and also the creation of kind of the icon of the building through the facade and the massing to create a unique product here in Brooklyn.
Thanks very much, Matt. Now, Jody, over to you.
Jody, I think you're muted.
You may be on mute there, Jody.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. There I am. Hi, my name is Jody Stassi, and I'm the Executive Vice President with Corcoran New Developments. We worked side by side as the consultant from everything from the very beginning of market research through planning and design, branding and marketing, and then ultimately launching the Amberley into the market through lease up. And take a very kind of detailed approach to where the market is at, what the market needs, who the demographic is that we think will call it the Amberley home, what are they looking for in a build to rent, what is the lifestyle that needs to be included in this building, how do we maximize the space and not just the apartments, but taking advantage of the height, the views, and kind of working side by side with Matt's team to help bring this project to life.
Great, thanks very much, Jody. Now, Stephen, over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi there, I'm Steve Cornwall. I'm the Global Director of ERACO. We're an experience agency. We're annexed to Woods Bagot as a partner. I wasn't directly involved in the Amberley project, but I was the Chief Marketing Officer looking at it from the other side of the river for about 7 years. I'm here to talk about a couple of things today, but more specifically about when I came from Australia, multifamily was foreign. It is foreign to the Australian market. I learned the hard way about what that amenity wall looked like. And now I'm working cross purposes for ERACO as the Global Director, really in Australia and in New York City, across both countries and both continents. And I'm keen to talk about what it means for builders, developers and the Australian landscape as it grows into this amazing new territory.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And we're on to Adam.
Hi everybody, I'm Adam Pillay. I wear a couple of hats for Greystar as the head of Asia Pacific and then also the global head of fundraising. So we have a very large business. We manage over 700,000 units across the globe. I believe we're the only truly global owner-operated developer of multifamily, student housing and senior out there today, which is a good thing. And we entered the Australian market in 2017 with taking a view on the opportunity in build to rent, and have been active in raising capital and deploying capital into deals here. We're excited by a lot of the tailwinds that sit behind us. So I'm bringing 12 years of time in the US and then coming back to Australia about a year ago to have a lot of touch points with multifamily. I'm happy to share some thoughts.
Thanks, Adam. And finally to Kate.
Thank you, Nathan. Hi, Kate Heaney. I sit on our executive team at CBRE, Head Client Care and our growth platform. And the orientation for that growth platform includes research of emerging markets. And this build to rent product, certainly for Australia, for us is absolutely falls front and centre on that. Sorry, and this has been the last 4 years of a really great endeavour. We have an enormous business in the US, and we're bringing that talent and that expertise to Australia, and probably I chair our team in build to rent, and ultimately probably just an annoying devotee of the build to rent philosophy and product that I think suits our market.
Thanks, Kate. And I hope we're all actually devotees and about build to rent, and clearly we're all keen on the issue, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So thank you all for that introduction. And now I've got some questions that I can dive into in a bit more detail, and then once we've run through some initial questions, we'll open the questions to all of the guests at the event today, and we'll get some broader questions. So Matt, firstly to you, certainly in Australia we're starting to talk about some of the planning and design issues that could either enhance or limit or in fact make or break the industry here. But what were the planning design challenges you had and really any opportunities you had in putting together the Ambly?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the opportunities were, it is a really prime site. So it's a large site, led us to be able to play with the massing quite a bit. Also, just its proximity, the views which I mentioned, and it happens to be specifically located at a really opportune location within the city, so that its views are unobstructed because of the adjacent Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges. So that was a huge advantage, which we took a lot of care to foster within the design and the massing of the building. You know, I think as far as kind of make or break within this, and Jody can talk about this as well, but a lot of it, and especially in any of the build to rent projects that we work on, it comes down to efficiency. So making sure that the core elements, the corridors, are as tight as possible, so that we are getting as much value out of the units and the amenity spaces as possible. So there's really kind of a very limited amount of room to kind of flex that for kind of maybe additional design elements or kind of other things within that. And that goes all the way down to a lot of times in build to rent, what we see as a difference is also kind of the floor to floor height. So kind of pinching everything down both in plan and section as tight as we can get it to make sure it's still a great product for Jody to take on it and kind of make those sales, but is as efficient as we can make it.
And what changes in the design and amenities do you see between the build to rent in buildings such as the Ambly and a normal condo or build to sell type product?
Yeah, I think what I just mentioned is certainly one of those where, you know, the floor to floors is one thing that we would see very differently between condo and build to own and build to rent market. So that changes the massing quite a bit. Certainly the level of finish changes, especially within the units. We're certainly looking at a different kind of material selection. And I think to a certain degree, and this would be an interesting one for Jody as well, but to a certain degree, I think also the way we address the amenity spaces. So I think that those within a build to rent project need to be flexible so that it can grow with the tenants over time and also be programmed day to day. I know Steven's got some interesting ideas on that as well, but I think the way we program those spaces and the amenities and how they interact with public spaces is really important on a build to rent.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. Now I'll jump to Jody. So with your leasing background, how do you balance the good design with the financial aspects of a build to rent versus a build to buy?
So what's interesting is, to Matt's point about this specific site, it had tremendous opportunity for views, and the premium that you would get on a build to buy versus a build to rent for height and views and exposure is much different. So this is like a premium site for a condominium opportunity, and you know the developer was looking at this as a long-term hold, and we looked at it as a rental. So trying to find the balance of not wanting to over design this, understanding what the demographic was and what really how the building would perform in the market, and where the tolerances were for certain size apartments and ultimately monthly rents, like really kind of working side by side with Matt to understand size of apartments, how we distribute that product, how we take advantage of, you know, premium view corridors, and what does that mean financially ultimately for the rent roll. And it's a very tricky equation, because on a building like this with this incredible opportunity for the exposure and the views, you tend to want to bring all your larger apartments to the top of the building, which you absolutely would do if it was a condominium. But in a rental, you're going to look at it a little bit different, and you're going to distribute that product a little bit differently, which means taking some of your more efficient studios and one bedrooms all the way to the top of that tower. So it's an interesting combination of how you put those floor plates together and how you actually distribute that product throughout the building.
And so with those design elements, Did you emphasise those as part of the design project? Did you have any input as the leasing manager into that? And is there anything else that really you'd emphasise about the design within the apartments rather than just the view and the location?
So what's critical there is really looking at each component of a rental, like a build to rent building. And what's important to the end user is really how those apartments live within the apartment, and then how the amenities enhance your lifestyle as a resident there. So really looking at each individual floor plan, we were very involved with doing floor plan reviews, making sure that we eliminated circulation, that we were working within the right square footage ranges, which is trying to deliver a great one bedroom in 650 square feet, which is really kind of the average size in the New York City market, and having all the right components. So making sure you've got the right storage. We're dealing in a market with multiple seasons. You need something like a coat closet, which can very easily become a design challenge when you're trying to fit it into a plan that is, efficiently designed. So we spend a lot of time looking at the interiors of the apartment, actual design and layouts, making sure they're furnishable, making sure they can handle the furniture that is expected of the tenants that are going to reside here. And an example of that is, while you may have a great kitchen island in a 2-bedroom, you still need to be able to have a table with 4 chairs and a proper living room. So we work very closely with the design team to make sure that the apartments are delivering the internal lifestyle that's going to be expected from the market, and then focusing on the amenities to really enhance that lifestyle. And how do you make that lobby usable? We had a tremendous lobby that was a through lobby that had lots of space, and how do we activate that lobby as part of the amenities? How do you program it so you can see people working down there, sitting there on their laptops, almost like you would in like a hotel lobby or a coffee lounge? We break down that focus to like health and wellness, and then, lifestyle and entertainment, and try to size those amenities right so that they are meaningful and purposeful, and that they actually get used by the tenants in the building.
And Jody, the key question that I'm sure everyone wants to know is, how's leasing gone this year? Has COVID affected it? Is it still active? How's the market?
So Amberley has actually been completely leased up and is now pretty much in a stabilized building. I think the challenges that we're experiencing this year is the amount of vacancies that are happening across the city. I think the Amberley, just with its design alone, and the opportunity for outdoor space, those outdoor terraces have become very important to people like searching for homes in New York City right now. So I think that the Amberley is designed to kind of wear well through COVID and still deliver the quality of an apartment that people are looking for, especially when they're spending more and more time in their homes. And I think an exact design example of that would be how Woods Bagot approached the kitchens, which are very much usable and can support small families to larger families, and are places that you can actually cook a meal and serve a meal. And I think that, with everybody focused so much right now on how they're living within their apartments, the Amberley checks a lot of those boxes that will help that building, fare really well over the next couple months.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Jody. Now, Adam, Greystar, I mean, you're huge in multifamily and build to rent around the world, and you've expanded through internationally into many different jurisdictions. How do you think the Australian renter demands are going to differ to your other markets around the globe?
Yeah, it's like the classic question, right? When you come to a market which has historically been individual investors owning apartments, as to, well, what does the renter want, right? And I'll use an example before getting to Australia, but when we went to China, we immediately assumed it was going to be completely different to everywhere else in the world because of the different, stark differences in culture and demands. And so we spent a couple of months doing a market study, really trying to understand, what the renters wanted, and guess what came out of it? There were some really key issues that they wanted to focus on. One was security of tenure. One was lack of amenities and services, and the other was, the ability to have a community which is sort of like-minded people. And lo and behold, that's exactly the same thing that we saw in London. It's exactly the same thing that we saw in many of the new markets we entered in the US as well. And so what I'd say is, when you look at Australia, you've got cities like Sydney and Melbourne where, the 20 to 35-year-old cohort represent, almost over 2/3 of the, I should say 2/3 of that group are renting already today, right? They're renting from people like you or I who own an apartment. But the single greatest concerns they have are very, very similar to what, every other market we've entered into has experienced. So to talk about the differences will lie within individual cultural elements for sure. But I think if you look at the key kind of items within that demographic, that target demographic, which we like to look for, there's more similarities than differences, frankly. And so we think that's a great kind of sign for us to go and create an institutional asset class here, which, long-term investors can enjoy a very stable and durable cash flow out of.
And Adam, you mentioned tenure. There's been some misconceptions about the length of each lease and what you need in the markets to provide that tenure. What's your experience on the length of lease that residents want?
Look, most residents will typically take a 12-month lease. In certain cases, you might have something shorter, but then your rate has to reflect that risk. In certain cases, you might take something longer, and again, your rate needs to reflect that length of lease. But an important component of multifamily is that you do need a level of turnover in your buildings, and it's normal to have that, because that does allow you to re-rate apartments to market style rents, and so that can go up or down, obviously, but it's an important component in managing through that vacancy period and that lease up in order to create a growing cash flow over time. And so I think Australia will be very similar. I can't imagine signing, at least when I was a student and a young professional, signing a 5-year lease to live anywhere. I think the reality is you want options, and so as your income grows, you may want a bigger apartment. You may move in with your girlfriend. You may want a bigger apartment. You may lose your job. You may want a smaller apartment. All of these factors are important in the renter mindset, because what they're looking to do, which is different to an owner, is minimize their monthly check rate, but get the maximum value for it. Whereas as a buyer, you're going out and trying to stretch your dollar to get as much space as you can. And so by virtue of that, the type of unit you're looking to move into is going to be different. And so sort of long-winded answer to say, I think 12 months is probably the right starting point, but we are flexible as we need to be through our lease ups.
Thanks, Adam. That's interesting, because a number of the legislators in Australia think the build-to-rent means very long leases, and they're building that into some of their rules. So I think the industry still has some education to do there.
Well, I think the key there, just to add to that point, is the lease tenure this is a very retail, customer-orientated asset class, right? So you have to think about what your renter wants. In terms of ownership and maintenance of a building's characteristics, the people that should own this can be individuals if they're wealthy enough to own an entire building. But more likely, what will happen is you'll follow the rest of the developed multifamily markets around the world, and you'll see institutional investors own this asset class, because it really is a commercial real estate asset class, right? You're creating a cash flow that can be repeatable, which is very well accepted by groups that are looking to diversify away from things like stocks and bonds, right? And so that, I think, is a very important factor in the decisions for the local governments around saying, hey, as long as you keep your building as a rental, you should enjoy, all the benefits that we're planning to give to you. But for your renters, so long as you can ensure that people can have a home and you're not raising rents to the point where you're creating too much vacancy or pushing people out of their homes, then you should be fine, right? And that needs to be left on the landlord's kind of responsibilities to ensure that.
And then, Adam, the sort of similar question to Jody: what's been the impact of COVID on your operations?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll talk about multifamily first. I think multifamily's resilience has really shown itself through this period of time. As most people were forced not to go to the office, people had to stay home, and so that really this is a needs-based asset class, which really proved out its need over the last 12 months or so. And so what we've seen, if I look at our US portfolio, we're sort of 98% collected on all of our rents. Now, rents being collected is different to rent growth, and we have seen some pockets of the country where rent growth is coming backwards, right? But broadly speaking, you're still cash flowing out of these assets, and that's important. For our portfolios as a whole, we've seen moderate rent growth through the cycle through COVID, but what we have seen is a differentiated use of our amenity space. And this is important because I think this will translate into how we think about design and construction going forward. To some of Matt and Jody's points a little bit earlier, and this will be global, because I guess COVID being a global pandemic, it's really been a bit of an accelerator for a number of things we were thinking about already, but then required us to then implement in our buildings. And so, what do I mean by that? Practically, we've seen the need to have slightly larger common areas so that we have enough room for people to be adequately spaced out between each other. We've seen a greater request for co-working space, through our common areas. That could be an area for us to generate some revenue as well, beyond what we have now, or in partnership with, co-working operators, if that's what we think is the best course of action. So there's going to be certain elements that have come out of this, and I do think the work from home, component of our office lifestyle will continue in some capacity. At least there'll be a wider acceptance of it, given the technology kind of infrastructure is there to do it. So as a landlord and as an operator of multifamily, we have to obviously ensure that our buildings maintain up to spec to cater to that changing demand. So long story short, operations have been okay and holding up well, and I think it is going to be something that will impact and influence our design and construction going forward.
Thanks, Adam. Now, Sydney's seen the launch of the first sort of institutional grade build to rent product by Mirvac under the brand of Live. So Steve, what is the role of branding and the experience in creating a meaningful differentiation in this market?
Well, I think the first thing is this will be a commoditized play like most other commodities that become very popular in the market. I mean, before I get into the idea of loyalty and the idea of brand experience, I think there's two key rebuttals for Adam's overview. A lot of the market in Melbourne that I'm talking to, a lot of developers see this as a road to groom people to build to sale. They see rental as a pathway potentially to sale, not as a lifestyle choice that people need to make. So I think what's happening in the Australian market is a lot of developers don't understand that actually build to rent is not development. It is an operation. It is an absolute ecosystem. And yes, there's a building, but there's also consumer data and surveillance of those people and understanding the user and how they use their building. There is amenity wars at play, absolutely, that I'm seeing. It's a race to the bottom. How much more amenity can we add in? I think to Adam's point about the idea of co-working, we've had every single developer throw the kitchen sink at us as to what kind of amenities are required to retain young millennials in particular. But what we're seeing in terms of retention and the link between, say, the user and the owner and the operator is that there's got to be a place where the subscription culture that's sitting very squarely in around the millennial gives them the choice of what they will and won't pay for. I think it's very difficult, I think, and to Jody's point about the rents and the premium rents that sit in New York City. And by the way, Jody, you mentioned 650 square feet as the standard one bedroom. I think there were 35 square metre apartments in Melbourne. That's the race that we got to in the bottom of the market. Cheaper, smaller. That is not the world that anyone wants to live in. So what I'm really excited about with build to rent, and by the way, we've recoined it build to relate, but build to rent is a developer term, right? Build to relate is about the user. How are we building something for this ecosystem, for their community? And as much as design plays a key role, all the services, and I'm going to give Graystar some credit here, the actual services and the way they service and lease up a building and then maintain those relationships is absolutely key. Not every developer can do it. It's a very different ecosystem. Loyalty is about the service. As great as the design can be, if they don't have the service, if it's not a great experience once they're living there, the design won't really matter. So it has to be about the ecosystem of the operation. And yes, of course, the design's got to be great, but if you put three key pillars around what the operation is, it's the data and the consumer experience, it's the physical asset, the design, and it's the amenity. And my view, of course, on the amenity is that there's only so much amenity you can afford to put in a building before it becomes cost prohibitive. Certainly over a 30-year play, you've still got to maintain it. And so I think that we should be broadening the experience to the neighbourhood also. Build great amenity, but don't close it off to the neighbourhood around it, because that's going to create a better experience, and I think a better community overall. And loyalty.
Now, Australia's got a real home ownership ethos, and all of the politicians still build lots of our policies around home ownership as distinct from renting. So what are the cultural barriers that developers are going to face and the industry is going to face in bringing build to rent to the market in Australia?
Well, I think what Adam just mentioned about research in China, if you think about the migration of Asians to Australia, and certainly the growth, I think 31% of millennials in Sydney and Melbourne are Asian born, weren't born in Australia. There is a culture of ownership in China, certainly in Asian born Australians. 1 in 5 millennials in China own their own home outright, and it's a cultural piece of investment to own the property. And that's different to say 1 in 8 Australian-born millennials are pushed to own a home. So there is a cultural difference based on the multicultural nature of Australia, and the fact that the Chinese-born and Asian-born millennials absolutely strive for ownership. It's part of their culture to own. And if you look at Melbourne in terms of growth, it was fueled and funded by Asian investment. I mean, the investment market's dropped out. Of course, affordability is still difficult. And of course, we've got this issue of scarcity of products. So all of that is still happening, and it's going to still be a long play to provide enough amenity and enough build-to-rent product to service the market. And there are a lot of people running to it without knowing exactly what's involved. The idea of institutional investment, which I think Adam says is obviously a road in the path, I still think that's got some barriers in front of it. People don't know how to value those buildings properly yet, and there's been a cultural change there to make that happen in the market. So I'd like to think the road was smooth and straight, that Adam nicely laid out, but I think it's got some hurdles and challenges, and it's going to take some time, and it's going to take delivery by people like Greystar to prove out to the audience it is a lifestyle choice and not a backseat. They've got to see it as a lifestyle choice and something they can do. COVID has actually made this better, because in some ways what we're seeing is people wanting to rent their city apartment and own a country home. And that's become a bit of a trend. Certainly, I don't know if Jodie's seen that here in New York, but there's certainly people looking at moving out of the city because they can now work from anywhere and rent something smaller. So I think build to rent really has and multifamily will have a big play. COVID should actually do the opposite of what it's doing to build to sale. It's actually going to grow, I think, in this case.
Thanks, Steve. And then Kate, so where are we in Australia at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. It's fascinating listening to each of our panelists, and I'll kind of call on some of the language that was used and the learnings certainly we've got. But kind of typifying it as these awkward teenage years. It's been a really intensive, probably last 4 years that we've really started getting people to kind of embrace, understand, decide it's called build to rent versus multifamily. All these sorts of really tricky elements that. And we're testing and pushing, and so much of what Stephen just said about, do we really understand it? Do the developers understand it? We've had 30 years plus of, fantastic build to sell product, and people are having to use the term we have to in COVID pivot to a new product, a new a new asset class, and ultimately an institutional asset class, as Adam said. So we are at a really tough point, but we have really high interest, energy, at least 9 to 10 or so really active groups in the market, obviously, as we said, Mirvac, etc. But we're in that challenging time. Every single thing is being questioned. Back to Jodie's point, tricky equation. We are at the tricky equation, and it is whether it's planning, whether it's tax, whether it's understanding the product well enough to execute, really changing the mindset that it is a professionally managed product as opposed to just a property managed product. The ecosystem, all this language that everyone's using is just a cacophony of incredible intensity to drive a new asset class, and we're obsessed with property. So we are the energy that we're seeing is just really the momentum building enormously every day. The inquiries with us across all our service lines every day. So the energy behind it is extraordinary. To the point the other said, COVID has really driven even greater encouragement of it, because ultimately what we're saying, that live, work, play, half of my team members were caught in apartments that they had no community, no amenity, no thing. So everyone's starting to go, you know what, I want better for my live, my work, my play. It is a little bit of a blend. How do we support that? So we are challenged. We are seeing fantastic changes. Tax rulings changing. We are seeing incremental discussions about planning. So really buoyed by that change. But it is, to everyone's point, it's a very tricky equation, and it's a different mindset. Bringing all that brand up front, bringing that management up front, bringing that amenity up front that we just haven't naturally done over the years. We haven't had to, but we now have to if you want to really determine and you want great product outcome and great project outcomes. But we still have a bit of a population inquiry at the moment. We've got COVID, we've got borders closed. That needs to pick up again. We've got expensive land. We've got expensive construction costs. So we just have to keep looking at this equation and really driving it forward. But we're really buoyed by it, and I think COVID has actually given it that boost and acceleration of what it's needed in this market.
But is there anything else on your wish list of things that we need, having taken the learnings from the mature market, what ideally would you want? Oh,
look, I think the ideal situation, if we look at our US and our, particularly US and UK, best UK, they were very buoyed by funding, certainly from government, etc. And we're challenged by this, and we also are challenged at this point working through sort of the tweaking of our tax ruling. But I think, and that's creating real challenges for obviously for developers to try and get these developments up. We have to remember we have so many other things that are a little bit more challenging than our counterparts. So, gosh, if we got funding and we got incentives and we got all these things, it lay down there. But we don't have that. But we are seeing those incremental changes. The other things we have to start seeing is this recognition of planning. We haven't defined it properly. So therefore, there are a lot of things that are flipping, or people saying, hey, this is a build to rent product, a 45 unit, a block without much amenity that has been rebadged because of the market is not a build to rent product. We have to be a little bit more realistic in our definitions and understanding. And if we can get a bit of easing on all of those other components, quantum change is very hard for any government, for any local and federal government to do, but we need the conversation to continue. We need to all be buoyed by the conversation to show people that this is a very viable product for a big percentage of the community who need this, which will take pressure off that lower end of the market that needs to be released, that affordable side of things.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks to each of you for your initial comments. So we'll throw now to some questions from our audience. And Matt, this one might go to you. Clearly the views and the location are good, but one of our attendees says that prior to the building opening, the location wasn't really pedestrian friendly. And so how did you build that into the design, and has the building now stabilised, have footpaths been widened? What have you really done to rejuvenate the area to make it more pedestrian friendly?
Yeah, it's a great question, because that person's absolutely right. It wasn't the friendliest place to walk around kind of before this development happened. I think what we've seen kind of come from this development, one is, I think the establishment of that street front, which I mentioned kind of in the video earlier, that was a really important part. There's a lot of parking lots or other very porous areas against that street edge, and kind of putting something up there that has an edge to it that creates that urban street front environment was really important. It's a little bit tenuous right now. It opened at a kind of strange time just before the pandemic. So while the office is open, the residential units are open, the retail has not yet opened. So we're in a little bit of an in-between flux zone, but we have seen just in the 270 units that are in the residential tower, there's a lot more foot traffic on the street going to Subways in the morning, even still, or kind of just out to the neighborhood for eating and drinking. So we have seen that pick up a lot. I think part of what we did in the design, in addition to that street edge, was the creation of that public plaza, which I mentioned. So really carefully creating where that sat within the site, making sure it had a lot of sun on the south face there, and it had adjacencies to those streets so that it was really porous for the public to come into the site and really be a part of this project.
And then a question for Jody and Matt. Was the office component really important? Does that play into the leasing of the residential apartments, and was it a requirement of the city, or was it just good design, good investment?
I can jump in first, Jody, and then if that's okay. I was going to say it's kind of linked to the public plaza, which I just mentioned about. It's kind of an interesting part of the New York City zoning where we actually had maximized the amount of residential area we could use. So through the creation of that public plaza, we got bonus area. And this, again, certainly conversation with Jody and team about what was the best use for it. We went through versions of the office, of dormitory, of hotel use, education use. At least from our opinion, I'm curious to hear Jody's thoughts on the leasing part of it, but in our eyes, given its location kind of near Dumbo, there's some higher education facilities nearby. So looking at this as kind of a maker space, which we're seeing already in some of the adjacent neighborhoods, made a lot of sense, at least architecturally, for that use type. Wasn't required by the city. That could be anything non-residential though.
Hi, so I think one of the things that the design of that commercial and office space did for the residential, which we thought was really important, was it gave us great amenity space on the top floor where we needed an additional lounge space and some outdoor space, and we were able to take advantage of the top of that office space to create some additional amenity for the residential. I think ideally we would hoping that something like a, kind of a maker space or creator space, which is very typical to like the Brooklyn lifestyle, would get somebody that could potentially live, work, play, like all connected in this one kind of new neighborhood. Because, speaking to a little bit of the before and after the Amberley, we really did, I think, introducing this building and creating the public plaza and really kind of opening up the space to the neighborhood, would give it a place that would, kind of welcome in the surrounding buildings, and hopefully, as that office building fills up, that there's an opportunity for that live, work, play to happen right within the building itself.
Thanks, Jody. So one of the key questions, and certainly an issue that we're working through in Australia, is profitability. So how's this playing out? How profitable is this development for the investor? I don't know who wants to answer that, whether that's Adam, whether it's Jody, who has insight from an investor perspective.
Yeah, we would not have, a good handle on exactly what I think a long-term, this building was planned for a long-term hold. So I think the focus on the design elements, the apartment sizes, was probably looked at a little bit differently than some of our other clients that we work with. But ultimately, the Amberley performed at the top of the market, and achieved what we initially anticipated in rents. And to me, that's a success story when we get to the end of a lease up.
Yeah, I guess just to play that question out, obviously we all have different roles in the life cycle of a multifamily investment. New York is an interesting market. It's very different to a lot of the other markets across the US. And so once you're through your lease up, historically you had very strong occupancies, which allowed you to, obviously have a very strong demand base. And this is the first time, I think in my career at least, where we've seen people choosing to leave New York because of the option to do that, where there's lower taxes and a better lifestyle, afforded in other other markets. And so, from Jodie's perspective, I think she's done an incredible job being able to get it leased up in the environment that she's been staring down on the vacancy side in that city. But to play it out as it relates to the Australian market, here in Australia, there's a lot of confusion, I think, around what a yield on cost is. And, we do have a market, as Kate said earlier, where construction costs are exceedingly high, right? Like higher than pretty much every other market we operate in globally, to be honest. And it's something that is unionized as well. So it's difficult to change that. Land values are extremely high, right? And they haven't really had to change because you've had a real estate market which has performed for 30 years. So a lot of landholders, are sitting on little to no debt, on those sites, and so have the ability to wait it out, sitting on, a large amount of inbuilt, unrealized gains. And so what does that mean? From a yield on cost standpoint, we have to use every tool in our toolkit to try to generate that higher yield on cost. That can be through design and amenity, that can be through service orientation, and how we drive, the yield up from that standpoint. And it can also be from how we structure the transaction specifically, whether that's debt and equity or through the acquisition kind of total transaction structure as a whole. And so, from an investor standpoint, we typically are looking to clear kind of a 4.5%, untrended yield on cost. If we can do higher than that, that's great. And we have been successful in, securing sites which have allowed us to do that to date. But I think that's kind of our sort of benchmark, so to speak, of where we need to be. And then, depending on the market, we look to sort of a rent growth profile, which will be probably in line with historic norms, but recognizing the next 24 months are going to be challenged, right? I don't think it'd be very smart to be assuming you can run at the 30-year rate of rent growth in Melbourne when you're staring down what we've been staring down during the pandemic. So while there's some good things happening at the economic level to bounce back in Australia, which is all positive signs, and there's great tax reform changes coming through, which actually will materially impact our underwritings to the upside. I think from a long-term hold standpoint, you're probably looking, depending on your, leverage profile that you're willing to take, but assuming that's sort of at 50% loan to cost, loan to value over time, you're kind of tracking towards a 12% type net return over, sort of pre offshore taxes over a 10-year period. So hopefully just put some numbers around what you guys are thinking of from an investment standpoint.
Thanks, Adam. So there's a range of questions that have come through around tenant management. How do you actively manage the tenant experience? How do you manage tenant retention? What are the costs that you have to build in to manage refurbs each year? And how do they play out as part of the tenant experience? So again, Jodie, as the leasing agent, you might want to talk about retention and what gets built in to the processes that you work through with tenants.
So in the New York City lease-up market, it's actually with a building the size of the Amberley, we'll actually lease in a strong market without a pandemic that doesn't seem to want to end. We would typically lease this building up within 12 months. So most of the time we've got the building stabilized before renewals even start to happen. The standard is different as far as, people vacancies after an initial lease up, and sometimes we're involved in that, sometimes we're not, but most of the time on something like the size of the Amberley, we'll get through the initial lease up and turn basically the tenant retention management over to the management company. Greystar happens to be part of that, and they're kind of moving that forward. But I will tell you from, a leasing management point of view and the overall experience, and somebody spoke about that, I think Stephen spoke about that earlier, the experience from the minute that they, arrive to move in, all the way through how the building functions, how the amenity spaces are maintained, and how management responds to tenant requests is so critical to renewals and retaining that tenant for a longer period of time.
Thanks, Jodie. And if anyone else wanted to jump in on that one before we move on.
I just wanted to add there that you know, as build to rent lands in Australia too, culturally thinking about the word multifamily versus build to rent. Multifamily in America, from where I see it, it does talk about multi-generational. It's not capped at an age bracket. It does have a multi-generational flavour to it. Build to rent and the research that we're doing in the market, rent doesn't have a good reputation. It's very much a young person's world. It's not something that older couples with older children might do together. And so there's those aspects of keeping retention, which is how do you make it broader than just a narrow audience? What do you do there? And then what amenities are required for those broad range of multi-generational sort of age groups? And so that's what I think developers might struggle with too, is the ecosystem of actually dealing with a broad range of different types of people, different types of socioeconomic backgrounds. And then of course, how far you're willing to push the rent before the decision to buy becomes viable. And I think that's a lot of decisions that we see in, well, do I rent or do I buy? Those decisions that are about amenity. What amenity and what other services can I get that don't, it's no longer a decision about money, now it's a decision about lifestyle. And I think with the rents in New York, Jodie's done an amazing job, because ultimately, there's probably some of the highest rents I've seen in a long time in Brooklyn. And that's because the amenity of the building and the services are absolutely outstanding, and it has to be that way. Developers can't run to rent without thinking about the full ecosystem of the operation, and I don't think a lot of them are prepared for that scale. Greystar are a well-oiled machine, as are Corcoran. I mean, these are big brands that know how to do it. So it is a risk, and Kate made that point, I think, quite clear, is the heady world of trying to transform from just a developer to build to sale to a full operating build to rent brand is not easy.
Yeah, I'd echo that sentiment completely. I mean, even if you look at the US, you don't typically see too many large scale developers of condos that do multifamily as well. It's usually one or the other, and it's because it's a very distinct set of skills that is required in a vertically integrated business and a different organizational design, frankly. And that's important because, you know, it's a huge investment to build one of these businesses up and to get the ecosystem, as Stephen coined it, up and running. And I can tell you in our experience in expanding into different countries around the world, now we made all the mistakes you could make as well, and we've got a long history of doing this stuff. But it's important to recognize that, you know, when you go to a new market where there is maybe not the same level of experience in place, we have learned time and time again that it's been important to build the infrastructure ourselves for our operating business in particular. But certain markets like Australia have very experienced development and construction people who can adapt, you know, when you bring your parameters around a transaction together, and that can really help, you know, boost your speed to market from that standpoint. And so I think as we think about Australia's market more broadly, I'm very encouraged, I think, by the fact that you're starting to see a mixture of domestic and international competitors in the space. I think that's going to create the best of all worlds. We're all going to learn from each other's mistakes, and we're all going to, you know, praise each other's successes. But I think the important piece of this is that you have multiple groups creating multiple avenues for liquidity, multiple service offerings that will cater to the demand of the renters in this market. But to be clear, this isn't meant to steal any market share away from you know, the condo buyers. What we're trying to do is address supply and demand in these cities and bring a different type of supply in alongside for sale, you know, residential, which will cater to the changing demand needs of the population. And what you should see over time is a more steady, I guess, approach to residential price growth versus kind of bubbles, which tend to happen more when you have only a for sale market. So
thanks very much.
Yeah,
that's great, Adam. Thank you for that, and thanks to Matt and Jodie and Steve and Kate as well. It's been a great conversation today. Covered a wide range of issues, and I've been really really pleased to be involved and listen and learn from each of you. So that wraps us up. Colin, back to you to close.
Thank you, Nathan. That does bring us to the end of today's discussion. Thank you to our panelists and of course Nathan. I would also like to acknowledge our host, Woods Bagot, once again, and co-partners Minter Ellison for their ongoing support. We are excited to announce that for the next virtual site tour, we will be boomeranging back to Australia and heading to a cutting-edge healthcare facility in Victoria, hosted by Centuria in March of 2021. Thanks again for tuning in and have a great afternoon.